Hello, my name is Raynah Fandozzi, and along with the help of Jeffrey Gillis-Davis and Ardith Bravenec, I'll be presenting to you physics-informed machine learning, specifically in the context of reanalyzing the spectral data from the LCROSS mission. So, a little background on the, oh, that's too far. A little bit of background on the process for finding water on the moon has not been straightforward. In the 1960s, it was nothing more than a theory that was shot down, then followed up by in 1994 and 1998, both were remote sensing that had led us to see some discrepancies and understand the motivation behind wanting to explore water on the moon further. Then finally, that led to the LCROSS mission in 2009, where NASA sent a mission to the south pole of the moon in order to explore this further. And now in 2025, I'm going to take that original 2009 data and look at it more. So, a little bit more context for the original mission. It was a two-part spacecraft with the Centaur rocket and the actual shepherding spacecraft, both of which made contact with the moon in the Cabeus crater, which is interesting because it's a permanently shadowed region, which is exactly like it sounds. And the impacts exposed a plume of dust that you can see on the bottom of material that hadn't seen direct sunlight for billions of years. The purpose of the mission was to determine whether ice water existed and to potentially identify resources for humans in the future. So in 2009, it confirmed that water ice does exist on the moon and that the lunar poles can support long-term human exploration. In 2010, Colapret et al. Provided analysis into the composition of the plume over time, but it was a chi-squared analysis which can introduce bias. So for example, if I were to try to fit ice water first, with using a chi-squared analysis, and then ammonia, I could get a different result than if I were to fit ammonia first and then water next. Secondly, it depended on a temporal data binning for the spectra analyzed. So for example, a graph through the paper was, 3 to 15 seconds after contact with the moon, whereas I'm going to be doing more of a holistic look with the spectra. Finally, this work was foundational, and now these machine learning tools is going to help us be able to understand more from that data. So in 2025, I'm trying to figure out what is beneath that water, what else exists there. So I want to understand what different volatiles exist and their potential origins in the permanently shadowed regions of the moon. I'm going to do this in order to put tighter constraints to facilitate the return of samples, to keep them pristine. So making sure that none of the volatiles sublimate in transport to make sure that the samples are usable. And finally, I'm going to explore two near-infrared cameras that were on the spacecraft, specifically data from 1.3 to 2.3 microns in wavelength. A little bit more motivation for this is the fact that Chang'e 5 suggests potentially other ammonia species that could be present. So there's a lot of motivation for a more robust technique than the chi-squared fitting. And for example, one of them is the issue of overlapping features and degeneracy. So if you take a look here, the feature from 1.45 to 1.55 exists in both ammonia and water. So being able to distinguish between which one exists is going to be very hard for a simple algorithm. Whereas I'm going to only pay attention to, and I'll explain why in a minute, but I'm going to only pay attention to that small green sliver you see that exists over that ammonia only feature as one of the main ways we're going to be able to classify it. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the workflow for this project. And my argument here is that technically only the third step involves real machine learning logic, but I'm going to argue that each of the steps are as crucial as the third one in order for this to be done. So the first one is synthesize and lab data. The second one is data preprocessing. The third one is an ML-based decision tree. And the fourth one finally is classifying LCROSS. So to provide a little bit of motivation for the extreme amount of synthesize and lab data we need to collect to train this model is going to be shown on this graph. So if you take a look on the x-axis, it's going to be the amount of training data used for the model. And then on the y-axis, it's going to be prediction accuracy. So the next things I want to point out here are the three different lines that exist on this graph. And the three different lines represent the different amounts of complexity that we allow the model to have. So for example, if we were to use a Gaussian fit for each individual feature, some of the parameters that the algorithm can adjust could be peak position, peak height, and the width of the actual peak. So if you take a look here, the red line at the very bottom represents the least amount of complexity for this model. where you can see that as the training data increases, so does the prediction accuracy, but it plateaus relatively early. Whereas if you look at the black line on the top, it has the most complexity and has the same trend where the accuracy increases as the number of training data sets used increases, but it takes much longer to plateau and much more data it is required to train the model. So as we introduce more compounds and more complexity, we're going to need that much more training data. So next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that exist in the data, and that's noise. So as you can see, if you look with increasing wavelength, you can see that the noise increases just based on how the size of the error bars increase. So as one beginning method to overcome this error is to only look from the 1.3 to 2 micron wavelength range and ignore, for now, the 2 to 2.3 micron wavelengths. The next big thing in machine learning is you want the training data to be as similar to the actual classifying LCROSS data as possible, such that when you put the LCROSS data in, it has no problem distinguishing between the different compounds that lay in it. So that means I'm going to implement synthetic noise to both the synthesized and lab data that I'm going to collect for the model. And so a couple examples, by the way, the graph on the very top right is a synthesized graph, where the one on the bottom right is one after synthetic noise was added. So some of the examples of the noise that exists within the LCROSS data is instrumental noise, high energy particles striking the camera, the analog to digital conversion that exists within the instrument, and photon shot noise, to name a few. Then, one more crucial step for machine learning is that garbage in equals garbage out. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of smoothing algorithms that I'm implementing to both the LCROSS and the data I'm going to use to train it with. So this first one is a moving average. So if you take a look at the graph on the left, that's the raw data, and then the graph on the right is the process data. And the issue with this moving average is, although it's been used a lot, sometimes it's too simple. So the next one I'm going to introduce to you is a Whittaker-Eilers algorithm, which is based on the Savitzky-Golay smoothing algorithm, but handles edge cases much better. And so you can see that smooth version on the right. And finally, a Fourier transform-based logic, where I Fourier transformed the raw data, then took only the top 14 frequencies in magnitude, then did an inverse transform to get that graph you see there on the right. The question is which one is the best? And there's no clear answer, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on this next slide, where I use the same smoothing algorithms on the synthetically implemented noise data that I showed you a couple slides ago, and got these three results. So if you take a look, they all have different pros and cons. So the bottom two on the left, which is the moving average and the Whittaker-Eilers, both get rid of that low-level noise, but the magnitude of the peak of that one feature there is only about half of the original data set. Whereas if you see the Fourier transform version, yeah, you have a lot of low-level noise, but that peak height remains the same. Finally, after smoothing all happens, we get to the actual regression algorithm, which in this case we found the best so far is using a gradient boosting regressor, which is a bunch of binary decisions added up to a tree to get this final result. And what the final result here is, if you take a look at this graph on the bottom right-hand side, it is the allowed parameters that we gave the model to fit to this data. And so that's the first step in this process, allowing the model to change those parameters to fit the data. And the next step is the actual physics-informed part of the machine learning, where the results it comes up with actually has to be physically meaningful. So for example, if I were to use an ML algorithm to figure out the percent composition, and it gave me something that was 102%, that's not physically feasible. So then we'd round it down to 100%. And the same logic is applied to this data set right here. Finally, it's time to classify. So already we've identified the regions where the best fit only includes H2O, which was that graph I was just showing you. And the next steps are to validate the smoothing model that eliminates the most noise for the highest likelihood of success. Then finally, comparing the volatiles that were in the original 2010 paper to make sure that we're on the right track. Then exploring Chang'e 5's finding in permanently shadowed regions. And finally, establishing a limit of detection such that the conclusions we reach are feasible given the noise in the data. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.